Welcome, everyone. We'll just give about 30 seconds for everyone to join the call and we'll commence. Make yourself comfortable, grab yourself a cup of tea. We've got a lot to discuss today. Thank you so much for joining us on today's webinar on Net Zero, Digitise to Decarbonise. My name is Davina Rooney. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Green Building Council of Australia, and it's my absolute pleasure to be your facilitator today. I'm going to be joined by our wonderful panelists, Holly Hine, Jonathan Monkley, and Neil Gadju, who I will introduce to you shortly. Before we commence, I'd love to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. But however, I would love to acknowledge that we are all on different lands around the country as we engage today. And so I would absolutely like to acknowledge that we're speaking from different locations. Feel very welcome to pop in the chat the land from which you're joining. And we'd love to keep celebrating the continuing connection to culture, community, land, sea, and sky. So part of today's webinar is an interactive discussion amongst our panelists. And so what we're going to do is just start with a little bit of housekeeping so that we can all get across this. Now, we have a couple of hundred wonderful attendees today. So for that reason, we're actually going to submit all questions using the Q&A box. We will be sharing the recording with you. And because we have so many wonderful attendees, we're actually going to keep the microphones muted, do this through the Q&A process. But your engagement is really important to us as we go through these. So one of our aims is to keep the webinar interactive. We'll get through as many questions of yours as we can. And we will be seeking to have some interactive polls so that we can absolutely take your engagement in the session. So before we start and introduce the panel, we'd love to learn just a little bit more about you so we can make sure that we tailor all the discussion to your needs. So I guess one of the first questions that we'll start to ask you on your side is, are you engaged in any discussions relating to carbon, managing carbon on your projects? And the second question that we'd love to ask to get a bit of a sense of where different aspects of our audience are you considering digital tools as parts of your journey and part of your strategy for carbon management? So thank you so much. I can actually see our audience jumping in and giving us some feedback. I'm just going to pause for a moment to let some of you jump in, and then we'll share and reflect a little on the results. Beautiful. I can see huge amounts of the audience jumping in. Oh my goodness, what an engaged audience. We have already 70% of our audience answering the questions, which sets us up really well to have these discussions. So when we're looking at, are people engaged in discussions on carbon management on their projects? What we're seeing is a large part of this audience is already involved in those discussions. So over 50% of our audience is engaged. So maybe we can share that first question. We've had 100% of our audience answered. So what that means is, yes, we have about 60% of this audience is actively engaged in carbon management discussions. About 10% of us are saying it's not part of their projects. Now, what's exciting is 25% of our audience are exploring this. So this looks like we're really well set up in this position. What this means is we have 2/3 of our audience is either activating this or considering activating. And then the second question on, are we considering digital projects as part of our strategy? We're kind of more split, 1/3 of the audience is doing it, about 1/3's exploring. And then excitingly, we've got people that are interested to learn more what it looks like. And then we've got a few of the audience saying they're not sure, it's not really a focus, they'd love to hear more about that. Well, that is why it's my great opportunity to introduce you to some of our powerhouse panel. We're soon going to open with Jonathan Muntley, who's a director and a head of digital services at WSP in the UK, and a Zero co-founder who's enormously passionate in this space and is going to share some of his expertise. If you watch your chat function, you'll see Jonathan's bio pop up really quickly if you'd like to hear more about his exploits and his leadership. Then really excitingly, to balance that, we have Holly Hine, who's the General Manager of Sustainability and Environment at Laing O'Rourke, who's going to come on and unpack some of the discussion with us and share some of her experiences. And then Neil Ganju, who's the Digital Director of Bridges, Aviation and the Roads team at WSP, is going to give us some Australian context of how some of this thinking has actually been applied to some of these projects. So we're absolutely right in the right position. You're about to be in the box seat on these things. So without further ado, it's now my pleasure to hand over to Jonathan Muntley to give us a bit of an insight on how to net zero with the use of digital tools. So over to you, Jonathan, and thank you for joining quite early in the morning in the UK.
Hello, thank you for having me. I've just shared my screen, so I'm assuming people can see my slides. Just going to double check before I start ranting. But anyway, thank you for the introduction. So my name's Jonathan Muntley. I'm head of digital services in property and buildings in WSP in the UK. Do work overseas a little bit, but I'm also the co-founder of a community called Zero. So a bit more about me. I'm a massive tech nerd. So I'm an architect by training, but I've done a lot of work in emerging and future tech. I'm also the co-founder of a community called Zero. That we do have a presence in Australia, so we do some stuff in. I think Build Sydney Live, we're going to be there, where we'll host some panels and do some discussions from the team down there. But Zero is a community focused on thinking and research about decarbonisation of building by non-sustainability experts. So even though I was introduced saying I'm a sustainability expert, I've learned through being involved and founding Zero how to start this journey, because it is a very complex one and it's a challenge for everyone involved. But if anyone's interested in hearing about more about Zero and the kind of stuff we do podcasts, events, conferences, and research, and very regular workshops around various different topics. But I'm going to start with, given what this topic's on, I'm going to start with what impact you can have. And this is something I was a little bit shocked at when I started exploring this. If you work in engineering, or the built environment in general, you'll be surprised at the impact you can have compared to the average person with regards to decarbonisation or sustainability as a concept. So here's a bit of a thought experiment, and excuse the maths, but it was done. I think it was done in a pub. And it probably was written on a napkin. But so there's 8 billion people on Earth, and we produce 37 billion tons of carbon per year. Therefore, you could say that each person is responsible for 4.6 tons of carbon to reach net zero. Again, look, it's caveated, it's a poor metric, but it's kind of in the right ballpark. Construction produces 4.5 billion tons of carbon per year. That's about right, with a workforce of 75 million. And if you say 10% of those have active decision making, now when you look at that, there's a few percent that have massive impact, but generally 10% of people have decision making ability. Therefore, that's about 27 million people. So you could say that those 27 million people are responsible for 163 tons of carbon to reach net zero. Therefore, if you work in the built environment, you have 35 times more agency to impact the built environment than the people that don't. I mean, take, for example, a typical commercial development, say in London, impacting the embodied carbon of that structure by 1% is your entire life's embodied carbon offset by one decision. But what does 136 tons look like? It's 165 trips between London and America. It's nearly 400,000 cups of coffee. It's nearly 70,000 Big Macs. So, or 400 cubic meters of concrete. So you can have a big impact on the world if you work in the built environment and you have a responsibility. And that was something I've learned through being active in the Zero community. But over to my area of expertise, and what have I learned through my work in digital services? So how can digital technologies support decarbonisation? Now, the interesting thing, digital is the tool to support various different elements: measurement, visualization, analysis. But the tools that we seem to be actively using are probably, or the tools that excite me the most are probably the idea of linking cost and carbon. I think is quite an exciting concept through QSing tools. The use of augmented reality or visualization for waste reduction, which I think is quite an interesting chat. The idea of kits of parts and a manufacturer's approach to design and engineering, something we're pushing heavily through the digital innovation team in the UK, the idea of manufacturing buildings rather than designing them. And digital twins, see my podcast, I'm very passionate about the concept and the idea of digital twins. So cost and carbon are and will be intrinsically linked in the future. So the idea of QSs measuring cost, but also measuring carbon, it's a trend we're starting to see on our projects, where they give you a bill of quantities, they give you a cost, but they also give you an embodied carbon calculation as well. It's not that simple. There's various different tools available. Things like Sterling is a tool we've been demoing in the UK, Sterling DCS, where it's a basic BIM-based QSing tool that just links carbon as well. So when you produce a cost, you get a carbon baseline through the EC3 product data sheets, basically the EPDs, which is quite clever, and it obviously gives a new metric to clients, and clients are starting to ask for this now. Now, an interesting metric I learned, and this is talking about the idea of waste reduction, because it's super low-hanging fruit, the idea of just not making mistakes on construction sites. Now, you can check this metric, but 40% of the world landfill comes from construction sites. And when I heard that, I think I nearly fell off my seat. But it's baseline, it's researched. I think the UK is 37% of its landfill comes from construction sites, just through errors, mistakes, and the way we work. Now, the idea of using something like, you can see there, the Atom augmented reality headset, just to verify your construction installation. Now, the tool's now starting to get towards sub-millimeter accurate, so you can kind of check what you've installed is correct. Now, waste reduction, like, it's not academic research, it's just not getting things wrong. And I think that is super low-hanging fruit, and the digital tools are available for us to do that. Now, the idea of kits of parts, I know DFMA and modern methods of construction have been around for about a decade, and it's been getting thrown as the answer to everything. But I do think the concept of taking a building and turning it into a kit of parts, and taking an approach to a manufacturer's approach to design for certain projects and certain types of developments is going to be key to waste reduction. And it doesn't necessarily mean the entire building needs to be manufactured in the facility, but the idea of certain elements. You can see this is Zero's construction stand, that is a kit of parts house that was manufactured from a Revit model that we take around different construction conferences, and that can build up to a 3-story house, and we just rejig it for the conference. But I do think that is a concept that needs to be pushed and driven, and WSP UK is doing a huge amount of work and research about that, and got some fantastic projects around the world. But the interesting piece, where I am an expert, and I'm happy to say that, unlike a lot of the other topics in net zero, the digital twins can save the world, I believe, or will be part of the solution. Now, digital twin has a lot of different definitions, but the idea of just having a digital representation of your asset, giving you the ability to measure what is going on through the design, through the build, and through the operation, is going to be a fundamental tool for the measurement of carbon at all life cycle stages. Now, you can also bring things like material banks and understanding where materials are so they can be reused. But I'm extremely passionate about this concept, and I do think that they're going to be a fundamental tool to the future of our industry. Now, there's some great projects in Australia. So the podcast I mentioned earlier, we interviewed very early on in our podcasting a company that was producing digital twins of mines in Australia, which is quite cool. It gives them the ability not to actually visit the mine, which is an interesting trend. My slides are broke, but let's just fix that. So the challenges to technology implementation. Now, obviously being involved in various projects that implement technology, through my career, it's very much been the bread and butter of what I've done through my industrial life. The challenges to implement technology are various, and normally what happens is people see a solution, they get sold a tool from a software vendor, and they think, right, this is going to fix everything. But that isn't usually the case. The problem is you need to focus on the people and the problem first. And this is the approach we take on every project we work on. And clients often come to us and say, oh, we saw this webinar or we had this phone call or saw this email, and this tool is going to fix everything. It's like, it's going to measure carbon, it's going to reduce energy. And that isn't necessarily the way to approach it. You really want to take the approach of understanding the objectives of the project or the problem, and getting under the skin of that first before you really start to build the technology stack or the solution back from that. And obviously, we're a people-based industry, therefore bringing people along on that journey is super important. So things like stakeholder engagement are also a really key challenge. And if you don't bring the people along, you won't implement the platform or the solution you're looking to implement. My slides are being silly. I have to click here. And digital isn't always the solution either. Problems are always multi-layered and multifaceted. So one of the early pieces of work Zero did, and I apologize for the mess of this screen, but it's meant to be messy. So Zero ran workshops over about a year with about 600 people of how do we decarbonize our projects, and this was the mess that was generated, because this shows the level of complexity required to actually tackle this challenge. And I mean, it gets worse when you start to scale it out. The Miro board was the biggest Miro I've ever seen in my life. But it takes on things like, you need leadership to change, you need the design process to change, you need the way you measure, the way people interact, the way teams are structured, the way construction changes, and there's another 5 or 6 things being added in the future. But the challenge is hard, but I think the solutions exist. It's just a matter of how we integrate them. So a couple of closing points before I hand over to the panel, and this was something that I thought was quite interesting. So Google announced last week, so obviously digital is always tabled as a solution to a lot of things, but Google announced last week that they have increased their operational carbon by nearly 50% because of the use of AI, which I think is a bit shocking. But digital tools do have an impact on carbon, so always think about that. The idea of getting rid of paper obviously has to be stored in a server somewhere that generates energy. And another point on the idea of measuring embodied carbon, Amazon announced, well, it came out last week that Amazon are only measuring 1% of their products when it comes to measuring embodied carbon on their products. And they only measure the embodied carbon of the products that they sell. So everything sat around Amazon is kind of ignored. So there's a heck of a lot of challenges around this space, but I think that's worth keeping in your back pocket. And thank you very much. And I think that is time for me. So I'm going to hand over to the actual experts now, and I shall get rid of my slides. Thank you very much, everyone.
Fantastic. What a great thought starter there from Jonathan. And the thing that I'd like to remind everyone is that we're going to be using your questions later. I'm going to start a bit of a conversation with our panelists, and then we're going to move to your questions. So down the bottom, you'll start seeing Q&A. And I can actually see wonderfully, we have our first participant who's jumped in. The other thing is we have also received some pre-submitted questions. So the one thing that I can guarantee on this webinar is that we certainly have a lot to start. So I'm going to just start with a bit of a quick fire challenge to each of the members of our panel. So bringing in Neil and Holly to join Jonathan at the moment. I wanted to have, in one sentence, how do you see the benefits of implementing digital tools to lower carbon? So Neil, I'll start with you, and then maybe Holly.
One sentence, helping people get the information they need at the right time.
Holly?
Yeah, informed decision-making for me.
Absolutely love it. All right. Well, what we're going to do is, what a great start. We're going to actually start to go into some of the detailed solutions that digital tools can deliver. And we're going to start unpacking some questions in here. So obviously the journey to net zero is a significant challenge for our industry. Digital tools are a powerful means to help enable decision-making throughout the project lifecycle. And particularly, Neil, in some of the infrastructure projects you work on that have some very long life cycles, Could I ask you, Neil, to share some of the insights on digital tools and, on how they're used for solving problems for both WSP and your clients to reduce carbon?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll give a bit of background on myself. I started my career as a quantity surveyor, and about 10 years ago, we were sent a structural design and a big set of drawings that I had to go measure the structure for, and we were given a Revit model as well. And this is back when we all had towers on our desk, and I got told measure all of the typical floors, formwork, concrete, and then someone else said, I reckon I can do this measurement as well using the model. So they got given a special office with an even bigger computer. And I think I was given 7 or 8 days to do it. And on the third day, I went to check on my mate to see how he was going with his model. And he was watching the test. So he'd finished in like 2 days. And I was like, okay, this is definitely a smarter way of doing things. So a lot of the tools that we're using at the moment predominantly speed up that measurement process. And if you've been involved in a life cycle assessment or doing a carbon estimate before on a project, you know that there's a lot of time spent chasing people up for that quantity information. So calling up cost planners or calling up site engineers or engineers to understand how much material do we have in this design, in this project, so we can then estimate the carbon. So the tools that I've seen used on projects take the material information from the BIM model, and then they link it to a carbon factor, and then that gives you the carbon footprint of the design. But that involves working with the designers to make sure you've got the right materials in the model, the modelers to make sure that they put their models together in a way that we can extract all that information. But we're doing it, well, I've seen it now being done predominantly in like the detailed design phase of a project, but we're starting to see it earlier and earlier because we're starting to get 3D models earlier and earlier in the design. I think you're on mute.
No worries. Has to happen in at least every digital webinar. Fantastic, Neil. And Holly, over to you. What do you see the importance of digital tools to assist in planning and sustainability efforts within your projects at Langeroog?
Yeah, look, the importance of these tools and what they offer, especially from now and into the evolution of what's possible, honestly just can't be understated. The analogy that Neil gave around, I think the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different result. And we are absolutely charged with delivering for this planet, which is decarbonising. And that is a giant Rubik's Cube that we're trying to solve. So doing things differently with digital tools in a way that can drive efficiency and real-time decision-making is absolutely critical. For us at the moment, the conversation that Neil started with around the ability to quickly determine carbon factors, carbon values associated with design, with materials that are in that design is critical. We need that information very quickly. As everybody knows, we're often working in very tight tender timeframes. The procurement process still has a lot to answer for. And we need to be able to speed up the information that we have so as that decarbonisation is not a thought after you've done cost. And for me, this is the first start of that, because as a contractor, we obviously need the materials that go into our carbon footprint, but then we need to work out the methodologies and apply the carbon footprint that goes with that too. So we just don't have the time at the end of a tender to be able to do all of that. And the reality is, to decarbonise a design, you need to be making those decisions on the way through to still make sure that the traditional kind of value for money of cost and program is still being respected for our clients further up.
Yeah, absolutely well said, Holly. I guess one of the next questions that we're going to talk about is overcoming barriers to the uptake of tools. And, as we implement this, I'm going to start bringing Jonathan back in. When we implement digital tools, it usually requires a cultural shift within organizations, project teams. Jonathan, you referenced people sometimes think a tool will magically solve all of their problems. So effective strategies to do this can lead to better integration and more impactful outcomes. So this was a common thread of questions that we've had pre-submitted in the audience chat. People would like to talk about coming over some of the barriers. They'd like to talk about the absence of direct policy, and how we encourage more people and organisations to think digital first in their carbon journey. It's a little bit of a where do we start? So, Jonathan, I might start with you for a bit of a UK context about what some of the catalysts for some of these projects was to use digital tools to increase sustainabilities, and some of the barriers maybe you could unpack for us that had to be overcome.
So I think Australia underplays itself from a digitalisation perspective, because historically you guys as a country were leading the way of the implementation of digital tools. When I was an undergrad, I was working with Australian businesses on BIM projects in 2005, 2006. So you guys were kind of ahead of everybody. But what the key catalyst for the UK was something called the BIM mandate. It sounds quite dramatic. But what the government set down was that basically said everything that was funded by the government had to implement BIM to what is now called ISO 19650. So it's an international standard. And it wasn't a legal requirement, but it was a funding requirement for a lot of projects. So government departments had to be seen to be implementing these processes to actually get funding from government. That's how it was pictured. And the result of that was a huge uptake from 2014. Every single government department was pushing this stuff. Now, it was a bit messy and things didn't go perfectly, but the fact there was a policy resulted in huge uptake. Now, all our major departments are pushing this stuff. The result of that was the private sector then sharpened the process, made it more efficient, and followed suit. So the London commercial real estate market is purely digitized now. Like every project is in London. Not all of the projects when you're talking like councils and housing, but the catalyst was policy. And there's been various policies implemented since, and there's a new information management framework policy coming out as well, which is the data side of projects. So policy has helped in a significant way.
Fantastic. And Holly, maybe we'll start with you and then go to Neil. What do we think's needed here in the Australian market for greater uptake? Is it as simple as education, getting it out there and access to use, or is it deeper than that? So maybe Holly, you first, then Neil.
Yeah, sure. I think it's a story of two parts. I think Jonathan just summed up the absolute lever and incentivization that policy has in terms of making people pull in the same direction and have consistency to be talking about the same thing, comparing apples for apples rather than apples and zebras. So I think that's a critical one, and Jonathan's covered it beautifully. There's a transition happening in Australia at the moment. We know that carbon, it's a matter of time until carbon will be part of that traditional value for money equation. It's already creeping in. We already have contract requirements that force us to consider carbon. It's just not front and center when you're looking at submitting your bid. It's woven through because of tools like Green Star and ISK and even some of our public sector clients' own rating schemes. So clients are paying for this and they're asking us to do it very well. So how do we do it well? We mature and we do it quickly, and we do it with tools that have sophistication that allow us to measure carbon on the way through with that informed decision making. The second part of that transition is we've got the accounting standards that are coming into Australia next year. So any company, so whilst policy might still be lacking, any company that has gone and set targets, and companies that haven't will be under pressure too soon anyway, their directors now have liability against greenwashing. And if you don't want to greenwash, you then have to be very transparent about what you're achieving. And that transparency will drive people to focus on achieving their, I guess, their obligation around social good, which is their net zero targets. So for me, I think that change is going to come in the form of a bit of carrot and stick. In Australia, it will be industry-led. The policy won't line up neatly, beautifully across all states. We will not have that harmonisation that we desperately desire. It won't come as quickly as we want. It will eventually land. But I do think it's going to be industry-led, and I think this is going to be a really exciting space where You know, I don't think sustainability should have IP associated with it. I think we should be sharing with the lessons and the wins that we're having, but that doesn't mean you can't have differentiators in this space. And the work that we put into our digital tools now will allow people to kind of position and get to the top faster, because they can do that quick decision making. They can have mature conversations about it. They can take shopping lists to clients early on and get their heads around what needs to be done with this particular asset in order to decarbonise, and what that cost might be in terms of cost savings, cost implications, methodology changes, program changes. I think the power that sits in tools is phenomenal, and the speed at which a tool can help us get there through these tight procurement processes that aren't going to change anytime soon is probably the most understated value that sits in those tools at the moment.
And Neil, bringing you in?
I think, yeah, explaining, like, agree with Holly that we should be sharing as much knowledge about how we're decarbonising our projects as possible across the industry. I don't think this is a competition. I think that we all need to kind of work together. I guess from my perspective, it's working out on the project, okay, who's going to be using these tools, and then who's going to be pressing the buttons on the tools. But for the people that make the tools or develop the workflows, make them user-friendly. I don't know if any of you, well, I'm sure there's people on the call who have used a tool like Revit before that we build all of these BIM models with, but there's about 1 million buttons in Revit. And we're now saying, okay, we've got to put all of this extra information in to do a carbon assessment. So I think showing people what's possible, sharing the knowledge, and then, yeah, if we can get user-friendly workflows and tools, I think everyone's on board with doing it. It's just trying to make it as easy as possible for people to join in.
Great. And I'm going to go to one of our audience questions. You know, we've been talking about some of the challenges of the extra carbon data, you know, that Google's using in AI, but we've had one of our audience, Michael's asked, what role will AI itself play in decarbonising the construction industry? What are some of the early purposes we'll see? So I'll start with Jonathan and then give anyone else a chance to jump in.
So I can probably share this. There's probably some various articles. I'll try and find the links. But WSP UK has developed a collection of tools. Now, the definition of AI always gets brought into question, but it's machine language models, basically two main ones to optimize the structural properties of a project. So it uses all the historical data from WSP's projects, and you put in a design and it will produce the most optimal solution for that. And it's really clever. A project called Daisy. But the idea of just optimization and doing 1,000 calculations that you would have to do and producing the most efficient one. It's still, I do think AI is going to drop into the Gartner trough of disillusionment in the next few months, because people think it's going to answer everything. And then I think when they start to peel it apart, it's a bit more complex. But so Daisy is a very powerful tool that WSP UK has produced, and I think it's used internationally. And a new one, a new tool that they've just launched with Future Homes UK, which is the idea of optimizing housing estates for thermal efficiency. And again, it just uses all the historical data that we have, puts it into a database, and then runs calculations and says this design will be most optimal from a thermal efficiency by positioning buildings like this. So it gives you the ability, at a real basic level, it gives you the ability to do very, very quick mass design without you having to physically work it out yourself. If you took an engineer, they can only do so much, but an AI model or a knowledge model or knowledge language model can take information from all over the world and give you the most optimal solution. So I do think it has a place. I think it needs to find its space, and the tools need to be developed. I think there is a huge amount of AI startups that are going to disappear because they are just rebadging stuff that's available on the internet and saying it's a construction AI tool, when in reality it's not. And everyone's trying to jump on the bandwagon. And I think it needs a couple of years probably to find its space where it's really going to have impact. But the tools are available and they're starting to appear. Even things like using OpenAI just to say, I'm building this. What's the most optimal solution available? Like the basic things like that you can do. But I think it needs a bit more time to cook is the term. And I think there's a lot of optimism, but it needs to find its place yet.
Fantastic. Well, we'll keep moving this conversation along. Keep your questions coming in. You'll see that we're starting to weave them into the chat. And in about another 10 minutes, we're actually going to turn solely to your questions. So I would love to see even more of what you would like to hear. So, I think one of the things to really help our audience unpack this is really go through some project examples where digital tools have really successfully supported decarbonisation outcomes. So many of you in the pre-submitted questions said, it's really great to talk about this in concept, but can you give me a really practical example of where you've used a digital tool, what it's done and how it's changed? And so I'm going to turn over to Neil and say, can you give us some Australian examples of projects where digital tools have been successfully embedded and what some of the outcomes have been?
Yeah, absolutely. So 2 examples I can think of off the top of my head. One of them is a big freeway interchange project we're working on at the moment down in Melbourne. So we piloted basically the client has told us we need to model everything. So every package now we submit drawings and we submit a data-rich BIM model as well. And we said, how can we tap into that BIM model and connect it to a life cycle assessment tool and start to get better, more targeted updates, life cycle assessment of each design package rather than looking at the whole job at an aggregate level. So we used a platform called iTwin, and that hosts all of our models. It hosts the federated model for the job. I think there's about 300 models in it. And then we've connected iTwin to a tool called One Click LCA. And this piece of work took digital team, sustainability team, and our designers as well, and the construction team to all work together to make sure we had the correct information for materials in our models. The models were connected with iTwin to One Click LCA. Sustainability had configured One Click LCA, so I had the right materials as well with the right EPD information. And now we're able to look at our structural packages when they reach their design milestone and understand what the embodied carbon is effectively. So to do that on a project that's that big with that many moving parts was it was quite a feat, and there's definitely been a lot of lessons learned and a lot of knowledge we can share from there as well. And I guess usually talking to the sustainability team when they're chasing information, they're chasing cost planners a lot of the time. And it's not as intense as a tender, but still everyone is flying by the seat of their pants. So to be able to set this process up has been a really good outcome. And there's now a dashboard for the project team to look at and to understand for their package, even down to an element level within their package, how much embodied carbon is there. Another example is earlier on in the life cycle of a project, and that's at the optioneering phase, like pre-concept design. So we were able to model a bridge, 8 different options of this bridge, model it in a tool called InfraWorks. Using that, we could get the quantities out, and we're able to give to that client, okay, here's not only the design and the reports for these 8 different options, but here's indicative what the quantities are. And then we did using that EC3 tool Jonathan mentioned before, work out some EPDs that might be relevant for that particular area for that bridge, and then give them indicatively, here's what the carbon footprint is of each 8 options. So they didn't ask us for that. We still gave it to them because we thought it was compelling to us more than just interesting to us to do that. And that's where you can make, I guess, a big impact on what the project's embodied carbon is going to be at that optioneering phase.
Fantastic. That's a really detailed example. I'm going to turn over to Jonathan and ask some of the best-in-class global examples you've seen that are, that have been implemented on key projects and some of the outcomes you've seen.
I'm going to ask Neil something first before we jump on that one.
Even more fun.
So one of the things WSP did or WSP UK Carbon, the carbon team did, was take all of the online databases with regards to carbon data and benchmark them against projects. And we found huge variations in results. So things like the EC3, there's about 10 or 15 different tools or databases we found online. And and the results varied wildly, like 100% variation in the carbon output of a project.
Mm.
How do you think we can fix that? Because that's a challenge.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Obviously, EC3 is the kind of benchmark
Yeah.
that everyone uses globally, but that requires EPDs. The data challenge, I think, with regards to carbon is something that I think needs to be overcome. And there's various different ways I've seen it done, but I haven't got the answer yet.
No, absolutely. A few years back, I went back to the well, and part of my research dissertation was looking at these different BIM tools, and I had similar results. The different plugins for some of the software we use resulted in wildly different carbon footprints for the same design. The way that we got around it on that freeway job that I'm talking about, that we're in detailed design at the moment, is sustainability pre-configured the EPD. Well, they matched the EPD values in one click to the values that are in the ISC calculator. So ISC is the Infrastructure Sustainability Council. They have a big calculator that has set values in it. So that was how we managed it on that project. Was we used, I guess, predefined values that were given to us.
Can I jump in and add something to this, guys, if it's okay? I just think it's such a relevant and timely conversation. It's something that we're unpacking in-house at the moment. And what we're speaking about today is the digital environment against the design. The design is something in a model, or preferably not on paper, but it's in a model, and it doesn't exist without the construction. The asset comes to life with the construction, right? So we've got to keep always looking upstream to see what it is that actually brings carbon to life. And what brings carbon to life is the activities in which you do, like the methodologies, the fuel and electricity that is burned, putting materials in place, and then all of the downstream activities to make those materials, which obviously then becomes the carbon factor to those materials. And I think what's really important is that we keep in mind what the upstream reporting requirements are, or what the upstream validation is of those requirements. So ISC and Green Star, that example you just gave about linking that to ISC, is a phenomenal example, because the ultimate validation and the highest order of sustainability requirement on that project, which we're on with WSP, is an ISC rating. So long as the tool is linked to the factors that are required, that's critical. But if you take a step back from that and go, okay, well, Laing O'Rourke as potentially a partner and client of WSP, we then have our own corporate strategy that we're trying to achieve that sits above and beyond what client might be paying for on a project. We've got net zero targets to 2030 and 2050. And so we're going to need more from that as well. We then need to be able to link our claims around these direct liabilities and our claims of decarbonisation in our annual reports to factors that are true and factors that that make sense and are recognised around the world. So it's not simple, and using the, we know what we need to use. For NGAs in Australia, we have certain factors. The calculator does it for us. For our SBTI commitment, we look at greenhouse gas protocol, where in place of an EPD. Now, the reality is only some materials and some companies are investing in EPDs at the moment. The story of Scope 3 is going to be the story of 1%ers. Every material slowly going to become mature, and we're going to have EPDs for paints and carpets and bolts and everything, not just concrete and steel that we currently have. My point I'm trying to make is it's the governance in this space that's going to make or break everything that goes into the mix to make this cake. That governance is going to be absolutely critical, because we need that governance to be reflective of what the project needs in terms of discharging its duties under the contract, like an ISC rating, Green Star rating, or client reporting. But then we need the governance to then also be strong enough and agile enough to be able to then suffice reporting that goes above projects, because these direct liabilities that are coming in means that everyone's looking at their targets at the moment and going, how do we reconcile that we're making gains in the right direction if we don't have governance over our data? So I just think it's a really important conversation, and one that people shouldn't think is going to ever be a set and forget, because it's going to evolve in the world of Scope 3.
I think that segues perfectly on the original question I got. And sorry for deviating from that, but it was that question.
Always more fun. Always more fun.
the interest, so the transition is, if you look at the way it's been done in different countries, so carbon benchmarking, there's stuff online, there's snake oil databases you can grab that you're not sure about. One of the processes that I've seen that I quite like is the idea, I think it's Finland, that the government has basically given the industry like a database that this is the benchmark. So everyone's kind of singing off the same hymn sheet, to use a metaphor, which I think is really good, because it means people can't kind of, I think we are seeing in the UK a little bit of people saying, oh, here's our project, it's super low carbon, and you can kind of manipulate the data a little bit just by the way you model or the way you measure. And I think a countrywide benchmark for carbon measurement is quite interesting. So the idea of EPDs is that everyone's driving down EPDs as a solution. There was a recent survey at a UK construction event that was focused on construction products, and I think the statistics actually shocked me. It was something like 87% of the manufacturers there hadn't heard of the term EPD. 6% had an EPD.
Now you're going to describe it, aren't you? That it's an environmental product disclosure, because we've got a very broad church on this webinar, from digital gurus to clients. So, you know, environmental product disclosures that have all the information in them that's sometimes captured in global databases like EC3. So you're absolutely right. Only 6% of people at this forum understood it, and that's why it's so important to lean in.
Yeah, so there's a big gap there, and obviously it's a journey for people to go on, and thank you for describing it, because I was just firing acronyms at a crowd that were probably very confused there. But a really good example of where it's worked, because it's not all bad, is a project that my team worked on. It's probably the best because I know about it. A project called the JJ Mack building in London, where we use digital tools. So its life cycle, we reduced the program by about 6 months, and we produced the highest ever rated BREEAM project in London, which is the equivalent of LEED that you might know. And the result of that, and obviously BREEAM shows that it's got good sustainability credentials, and it's only a part of the sustainability question. But the result of that is the developer can then, the business case is built for improving the net lettable area of that office because it's got a better rating. And I think that is a huge lever that the industry can pull, is taking it all the way back to before concept and looking at how you build the decarbonisation business case for the developers and the investors, because ultimately they're who drive our industry. The way they invest and the way they develop and the way they fund projects is what drives us. So the idea of looking at things like the JJ Mack building and various other projects and the stuff Neil's worked on, and saying, well, how do we build the business case that improves the outcomes of the project? Because obviously money speaks on a global level, particularly when you're looking at portfolios and people who invest in billions. Well, you mentioned the carrot. What I mentioned is the pointy carrot, which is the idea of lining up business case and regulation and policy. So if you can make the business case work, improving how much you can rent it for, and then getting it dragged along by policy changes, you've got something that's quite powerful that will create change. But the JJ Mack building, the idea, like I'll share the link in the chat if you want to read about it, but it's a really good example of how digital and digital twin and BIM and carbon measurement basically improved the outcome on a huge scale for the project. And I've got the link here, so I shall share it.
That would be amazing. We've also got another question in the chat from Danilo about some digital tools. So if you could add that in the chat at the same time, that would be amazing. Now, we're going to keep this conversation going, and we're going to look at the role of digital tools both globally and locally in this space. I mean, Jonathan's just made a really compelling case for, you know, the business case drivers and how some of those work. One of the things I'd love to see is, Holly, what are some of the biggest opportunities that you see that digital tools could provide for Laing O'Rourke and your clients? Absolutely providing those at a greater scale. How are you looking at those opportunities?
Yeah, look, I think most of it's been somewhat covered, but pulling together to be in one spot is we have clients that know what they want, but they don't know how to get there. They've got their own lofty targets. They're playing between private and public clients. They're playing a really important space in our shift towards 2050, and they're both on different journeys. And that's generally because of investor dollars and pressure that's coming in different ways. Some of them are more mature, and some of them are starting this journey. And I think the best thing that we can do as a collective partnership is to be able to give them certainty around what it is we're going to deliver them in their product. They're asking questions about carbon that they don't necessarily know how to value at the moment. So one of the best ways that we can use these tools is to break down any confusion that sits with what is carbon and put some really tangible options to them and link that to cost, link it to certainty, or link it to opportunity costs. Like, what happens if we don't do this? And the only way that we can do that, apart from advocating and client relationships in between tenders, etc., is in the tender environment. And that tender environment is hard and fast. So just giving them a number at the back of a design saying this design has this many tons of carbon and an alternative has this many tons, we need to be able to explain it in ways that are tangible, and by giving them a broken down kind of list of what that looks like and what that means. And I think that there's a crossover here a little bit with where AI, but also just good old construction expertise comes in, because there are implications of the transition to net zero. There are implications of using new materials. There's some blockers that exist around specifications at the moment. We can't put everything to that client that we want to be able to put forward because there's specification issues, and that's a real process. And there's reasons for specs, and there's a process that we have to go to gain the trust of the client, but also to remove those barriers should that shopping list be taken up. And then there's potentially some construction methodology interruptions. We know with the early phases of green concrete or low carbon concrete, there was some curing times, or you'd do parts of the program or parts of the job that didn't need to be weighted for a long period of time. So you could do green concrete in piles, but maybe you wouldn't do it somewhere else in the project. So there's considerations that need to be given to the construction methodology. Holding it all in a design conversation doesn't necessarily translate to what it looks like to build the job. So I think the absolute area that these tools can give us is that informed decision-making for optioneering. And that optioneering then needs to be considered and put forward in a shopping list, or even better, when our clients mature and ask us specific questions around this, or when carbon becomes a part of the value for money equation, you're A, able to validate it, and then B, able to show them how you plan on doing what you want to do to reduce that carbon, using what materials and what methodologies, and then what proof points will you use at the back of it, because design's one piece, but there's a lot of change throughout a project as well. So how do you capture that change? And then how do you deliver an as-built carbon model to your client? And I think there's some pretty exciting things in there that'll come in the future.
Oh, what a comprehensive answer. So I guess one of the things, I'm seeing quite a few questions come through on the chat relating to cost, so some people are saying, how do we make this cheaper? Or there's another question about how do we actually value this in tenders? So we're going to go to an audience poll and say, should we treat carbon the same way that we treat costs on projects? Yes, no, not sure. Okay, so we're seeing at the moment, this poll is pretty vibrant. We're seeing 70% of our audience asking, should we be treating costs on the same way? And then, about 30% of our audience isn't sure. A lot of these things are changing as new information comes onto the market. We also have a question about how the market values carbon. So I'm going to go to a question. We have Luca, who's involved in a digital green bond business for carbon sequestration in Europe. So, and what he's finding is the Australian policy on green bond transactions in carbon emissions is not as clear and consistent across areas. He's a little bit worried about digital tokenism and digital twins on carbon credit emissions being difficult in Australia, and has asked some of the panel's thoughts on that. So I might just start by acknowledging that the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative is actually providing a consultation on the Australian taxonomy on green bonds right now. They've been working with the Green Building Council and actually have a guidance out for consultation right now in the built environment. So now is absolutely the time to opt into this space. But I wanted to give our panelists an opportunity to jump in with any of their experiences using green bonds and digital infrastructure. Jonathan, have you seen this in the international markets? Does anyone else want to lean in globally and locally?
I'll start on, I mean, not an expert in this space by any means, but so Xero's involved with a company called Earthly that are, and they exist to basically get rid of fraud in this market, because it's basically they focus more on carbon credits for allowing people to offset, basically. But what they found was that they were founded on the idea of that market in the UK and probably in Europe has been through the mud in its entirety because of the amount of fraud going on in that space. Basically, they were seeing the idea of credits were being sold, or carbon credits were being sold 10 times to 10 different people, basically. Perfect for the carbon credit company, terrible for the planet. But what they've done is they're linking their credits and their individual assets to blockchain, so you can see and various. I mean, I know blockchain is quite a scary market for people, but the idea of linking a tree to the blockchain so it can only be sold once, so you can see it's been sold to. That's their methodology. I think that brings a lot more kind of. Now that technology journey has a huge way to go, but the idea of being able to see who owns it, where it's gone, who's owned it for the last 10 years, I think that's what's needed in this space. So the idea of digitizing the transactions on a global scale would allow it to kind of stick a bit better and get itself out of the mud, which it very much is in the UK and Europe at the moment, this space.
And a lot of the focus in Australia from the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative has been on third-party validation to try to avoid the mud in the way that you describe. So, okay, I'm going to take a question straight over to Neil about one of our attendees asks, when do you think Australian clients will start providing information-rich BIM with tenders?
It's a good question. They're starting to provide BIM for tenders now on major projects. I know that when we're asked to do a reference design, we have to deliver a high fidelity BIM model for our different design disciplines, depending on the client and depending on the region. So I guess it's just as the market matures more, we're going to start seeing that provided more often during tenders.
Fantastic. Holly, are you seeing it in your world?
Yes, sorry, had to unmute. Yeah, we are. And I think the great example was already referenced today, one of the biggest road projects in Australia. We're seeing that client specifically from the get-go, from 2-3 years out from the tender, was signalling to market that they wanted a fully digital set of as-builts, fully digital handover, and we've been able to kind of embed sustainability into that space. So we know it's maturing, and I know there's some questions on the chat around costs as well. And you know, sometimes it goes hand in glove with the more we ask for digital and BIM, the more that there's a cost curve associated with that. But the more consistently we apply that cost curve will come down quickly. The same principles of innovation. So I think the sooner we all lean into it and enjoy the benefits of what digital has to offer, the sooner we'll be able to have it as BAU without any big kickbacks.
Fantastic. Now, I'm going to ask for a quick snap response from Jonathan to one question before I close this. There's a great question about your golden carrot. Someone says,
the golden carrot.
Well, you said there's a carrot and then that we align them, you know, with the pointy carrot. There's the question here about how do organisations standardise their digital practices and align it with government policy. So just a quick snap for our audience here. What do you think the first step for someone starting that journey is?
It's got to be ISO 19650 and understanding the fundamentals of that standard. It has to be. And I know it's not perfect, but it's a great backbone to kind of the standardisation journey. And that's my golden carrot.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, thank you so much to our broader audience for attending today's webinar I hope you found it as interesting and informative as I have. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to panelists directly through LinkedIn and reach out to your WSP contacts or send an email to the WSP events team who'd be super happy to help you. Now, if you please keep your eyes on your inbox, we'll send everyone a recording of today's webinar to share with you. The next event in WSP's webinar series on energy transition is about sustainable legacies on the 27th of August. If you'd like to find out more or register, there's a link to the registration page will be shared in the chat. Finally, we'd love it if you'd take a few moments to provide your feedback via a survey that'll pop up so we can make sure that we continue to provide interesting and informative comment and content for you. Thanks again. Hope you have an enjoyable evening and look forward to joining you soon. Thank you.